What if I told you the Boston Tea Party wasn't about high taxes, it was about cheaper tea making everyone angrier? Or that Columbus never set foot on mainland America and died thinking he'd found Asia? Or that the first Thanksgiving wasn't called Thanksgiving, had no turkey or pumpkin pie, and 90 Wampanoag warriors showed up outnumbering the Pilgrims 2-1? History gets twisted. Not maliciously, just gradually, through repetition and our very human desire for simple stories with clear heroes and villains. So, tonight, we're exploring 12 misunderstood moments in American history. No sides, no drama, just facts that clear the fog. From tea monopolies to moon rocks, from witch trials to a certain election involving hanging chads. If you enjoy this, hit subscribe and comment which myth surprised you most. Now get comfortable, maybe close your eyes, and let's talk about some very angry colonial merchants and their expensive shipping dispute. The Boston Tea Party. When cheaper tea made everyone angrier. So, let's talk about tea and anger. And how sometimes making something cheaper can make people absolutely furious, which, if you think about it for more than 3 seconds, makes perfect sense in the most ridiculous way possible. It's 1773. You're a colonial merchant in Boston. You've built your entire business model around importing tea, marking it up, and selling it to people who apparently cannot function without their afternoon beverages. It's a decent living. You've got overhead, you've got employees, you've got a whole system worked out with smugglers and Dutch suppliers and various other morally flexible business partners. Everything's humming along nicely. Then the British Parliament decides to be helpful. See, the East India Company is drowning in unsold tea. Millions of pounds of it, just sitting in warehouses in London, going stale. The company is also drowning in debt, which is less aromatic but equally problematic. So Parliament passes the Tea Act, which does something that sounds great on paper. It lowers the tax on tea and lets the East India Company sell directly to the colonies, cutting out the middlemen. Cheaper tea for everyone. Problem solved, right? Except now you're the middleman being cut out. You've just been disrupted, as we might say today, by a government-backed monopoly with the world's largest corporation behind it. The tea is cheaper, yes, but it's also being sold exclusively through a handful of merchants who've been granted special licenses. Your business model just evaporated like steam from a kettle. This is what actually made people angry enough to dress up and throw things into Boston Harbor on the night of December 16th, 1773. It wasn't primarily about taxation without representation, though that was certainly part of the general frustration simmering in the background. It was about the fact that Britain had essentially given Amazon a monopoly on tea sales, and all the local bookstores were about to go out of business. The Sons of Liberty gathered that evening, somewhere between 50 and 100 men, though the exact number varies depending on who you ask and how good their memory was years later. They did put some effort into disguises, wearing what contemporary accounts describe as ragged clothes and darkening their faces with soot or coal dust. The whole dressing as Mohawk Indians thing gets a bit exaggerated in later retellings. Some might have worn blankets or feathers, but it wasn't exactly a theatrical production. More like a hastily assembled costume party where everyone agreed to look vaguely not themselves. They boarded 3 ships: the Dartmouth, the Eleanor, and the Beaver. Nice, solid ship names. Very trustworthy sounding. These vessels were carrying 342 chests of tea, each weighing about 360 pounds. That's roughly 46 tons of tea total, if you're keeping track, which is an absolutely absurd amount of beverage, and they just threw it into the harbor. For 3 hours, they worked methodically, cracking open chests with hatchets and dumping the contents overboard. They apparently tried to be somewhat orderly about it. There are accounts of them sweeping the decks afterward and even replacing a padlock they'd accidentally broken. Revolutionary vandalism with manners. The tea piled up in the water, forming actual mounds in the shallow parts of the harbor. Some of it washed ashore for weeks afterward. You could apparently smell it. The whole harbor smelled like a giant, disappointing cup of tea. The British response was about what you'd expect when someone throws the equivalent of $1.7 million of your product into the ocean. They passed the Coercive Acts, which the colonists creatively renamed the Intolerable Acts, because coercive wasn't quite capturing their feelings on the matter. Boston Harbor was closed until the tea was paid for. The Massachusetts Charter was revoked. British officials accused of crimes would be tried in Britain, not locally. Colonists had to quarter British soldiers in their homes. Basically, Britain decided to respond to economic protest with military occupation, which has historically been a very effective way to make people calm down and reconsider their positions. Just kidding. It's never worked. Not once. But they tried anyway. The fascinating part is that this wasn't really about tea at all. In the end, tea was just the excuse, the tangible thing people could throw into a harbor. It was about control, about who got to decide how business was conducted, about whether a government thousands of miles away could restructure your entire economy to save one of their failing corporations. The colonists weren't wrong to be upset. They'd built businesses, created trade networks, developed relationships with suppliers. Now, Parliament was saying none of that mattered because the East India Company needed a bailout. It was corporate welfare dressed up as tax policy, and it was going to put local merchants out of business. But here's the thing that makes it even more complicated. Some of those local merchants were smugglers. They'd been avoiding British taxes for years, buying tea from Dutch and French suppliers, making decent profits on contraband. The Tea Act actually made legal tea cheaper than smuggled tea, which meant their entire business model was about to become non-viable. Were they standing on principle? Or were they just upset that their illegal monopoly was being replaced by a legal one? Probably both. Humans are complicated like that. You can be genuinely upset about government overreach and also personally annoyed that your profitable smuggling operation is being threatened. These things can coexist. The Tea Party became mythologized almost immediately. Within years, people were already misremembering it, adding details, making it more dramatic. It became a symbol of American resistance, the moment when the colonies stood up to British tyranny. But it was also a moment when local business interests fought back against an unfavorable corporate merger using property destruction as negotiation tactics. Both things are true. History is like that sometimes. The immediate aftermath was mostly everyone pretending they had no idea who did it. John Adams called it bold, daring, intrepid, which is what you say when you approve of something but don't want to be legally connected to it. Benjamin Franklin thought they should pay for the tea, which shows you that even among the founding fathers, there was disagreement about whether strategic vandalism was an appropriate form of protest. Britain never got paid for the tea. Boston Harbor eventually stopped smelling like a wet tea bag, and the whole incident got folded into the larger narrative of colonial grievances that would lead to revolution. But the core irony remains. Cheaper tea made people angrier than expensive tea ever did, because it wasn't really about the price. It was about who controlled the market, who made the rules, and whether those rules were designed to benefit everyone or just prop up a failing corporation with good political connections. Some things, it turns out, don't change as much as we'd like to think. And speaking of things we misunderstand about the beginning of America, let's talk about a guy who got famously lost, Columbus and the discovery that wasn't. 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue. You know the rhyme. It's catchy. It's also doing a lot of heavy lifting for a guy who spent his entire voyage being confidently incorrect about where he was. Christopher Columbus died thinking he'd found a route to Asia. He had not found a route to Asia. He'd found the Bahamas, which is a lovely place, but it is definitively not Asia. The man made 4 voyages across the Atlantic, kept insisting he was near China or Japan, and never once thought, Maybe this is somewhere completely different. That takes a special kind of commitment to being wrong. But let's back up, because the word discovery is doing even more heavy lifting than that rhyme, and it's about to throw out its back. When Columbus landed in the Bahamas on October 12th, 1492, there were somewhere between 50 and 100 million people living across the Americas. The estimates vary wildly depending on whose methodology you trust, but even the most conservative numbers put it at tens of millions. These weren't scattered nomadic groups wandering around, wondering when someone would discover them. These were complex civilizations, with cities, agriculture, trade networks, art, architecture. The Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan had about 200,000 people, making it larger than most European cities at the time. It had aqueducts, causeways, floating gardens, and a sanitation system that would have made Rome jealous. When Spanish conquistadors first saw it, they compared it to Venice, except cleaner and more organized. The Inca Empire stretched 2,500 miles along the western coast of South America, connected by 14,000 miles of roads. They had suspension bridges, agricultural terraces carved into mountains, and a system of record-keeping using knotted strings called quipu that we still don't fully understand. The Mississippian culture had built Cahokia near present-day Street Louis, a city with earthwork mounds taller than the Great Pyramid's base width and a population that may have reached 20,000. This was in the 1200s, 200 years before Columbus went sailing. So when we say Columbus discovered America, what we mean is that he stumbled onto a landmass that millions of people already knew existed, then told Europe about it, which is less a discovery and more of an extremely delayed introduction. Also, he wasn't even the first European to show up. The Vikings beat him by roughly 500 years. Around the year 1000, Leif Erikson and his crew established a settlement at Landsog Meadows in Newfoundland. We know this because we found the settlement. It's still there. You can visit it. There are Norse artifacts, reconstructed buildings, and archaeological evidence of iron smelting, which indigenous peoples in North America weren't doing at the time. The Vikings called the region Vinland, possibly because of wild grapes, possibly because Vinland sounded more appealing than that cold place where we nearly froze. They didn't stay long. Probably because the locals weren't thrilled about uninvited European guests, but they were definitely there first. So Columbus was neither the first human to reach the Americas, nor the first European. He was, however, the first to establish sustained contact between Europe and the Americas, which led to permanent European colonization, which is significant even if discovery isn't the right word for it. What Columbus actually found on that October morning was an island the native Lucayan people called Guanahani. He renamed it San Salvador because apparently the existing name wasn't good enough. The Lucayan people who lived there had been sailing between islands for generations. They had names for everything. They knew the currents, the weather patterns, the best fishing spots. Columbus described them as friendly and generous, which they apparently were, right up until they realized what European contact was going to mean for them. Within decades, the Lucayan population would be effectively extinct, wiped out by disease, enslavement, and the general catastrophe that was European colonization in the Caribbean. Columbus himself never set foot on the North American mainland. Over 4 voyages, he explored the Caribbean islands, touched the coast of Central America and South America, and continued insisting he was near Asia. He had some interesting theories about the Earth's shape that involved it being pear-shaped with a nipple-like protrusion near the equator, which tells you something about his understanding of geography. The Americas were eventually named after Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian explorer who had the novel idea of suggesting that maybe this was a completely new continent and not just a weird extension of Asia. This must have been gratifying for Vespucci and deeply annoying for Columbus, who'd been arguing the opposite for years. The whole Columbus discovered America narrative took hold because it fit a story Europe wanted to tell about itself. Bold explorers bringing civilization to empty wilderness, manifest destiny, The March of Progress. It was cleaner than the truth, which involved complex societies being systematically destroyed by disease, warfare, and colonization. Indigenous peoples didn't need discovering. They had sophisticated knowledge of astronomy, agriculture, medicine, and engineering. They'd been managing forests, cultivating crops, and building civilizations for thousands of years. The idea that they were just waiting around for Europeans to show up and explain how things worked is both historically inaccurate and deeply condescending. But that's the narrative that stuck, at least for a while. Columbus got a holiday, his own day on the calendar, statues in major cities. He became a symbol of exploration and courage, which overlooked the parts where his governorship of Hispaniola was so brutal that he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains. Even by the standards of his own time, which were not exactly enlightened, Columbus was considered excessively cruel. The mythology around Columbus tells us more about what later generations wanted to believe than about what actually happened. They wanted a heroic founding story for European involvement in the Americas. They wanted to believe in destiny and discovery rather than conquest and colonization. What they got was a guy who was very good at sailing and very bad at geography, who stumbled onto continents full of people, who never realized where he actually was, and who set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the entire world, mostly through catastrophe for the people who were already living there. It's a complicated story, which is probably why the simple version persisted for so long. But history isn't simple, and Columbus, discovering America, is about as accurate as saying you discovered your neighbor's house because you'd never been there before. The difference being, of course, that your neighbor probably wouldn't be wiped out by diseases you carried, but the principle stands. And, speaking of myths we tell ourselves about early American history, there's this thing about pilgrims and a feast. The first Thanksgiving. 3 days of awkward diplomacy. Picture this. Autumn, 1621. Plymouth, Massachusetts. 53 English colonists, 90 Wampanoag people, 3 days of eating together. No turkey. Well, maybe some wild turkey, but it wasn't the centerpiece. No mashed potatoes, because potatoes were a South American crop that hadn't made it to Massachusetts yet. No pumpkin pie, because they didn't have butter, flour, or a proper oven. And also because the concept of Thanksgiving as an annual feast wouldn't exist for another 2 centuries. What they did have was venison. A lot of venison. The Wampanoag brought 5 deer, which, if you've ever seen a deer, is a substantial amount of meat. They probably had wild fowl, maybe some geese or ducks. They likely ate corn in various forms, squash, beans, and whatever fish and shellfish were available. It was a harvest celebration, which means they ate what they'd managed to grow and hunt, and tried not to think too hard about the winter coming. This wasn't called Thanksgiving. For the Pilgrims, a Thanksgiving was a religious observance, usually a day of prayer and fasting. This was a harvest festival, a secular celebration. The fact that we've conflated the two says more about how we construct holiday traditions than about what actually happened in 1621. The Pilgrims, who didn't call themselves Pilgrims, by the way, that term came later, had arrived the previous winter and promptly experienced what you might call a catastrophic first year. They'd landed in December, which in New England is objectively terrible timing. They had inadequate shelter, insufficient food stores, and no real understanding of how to survive in this climate. By the spring of 1621, half of them were dead. The ones who survived did so largely because of Tisquantum, known to history as Squanto, a Patuxet man who spoke English and taught them how to plant corn, catch fish, and not die. His own story is bleaker than anything in a Thanksgiving pageant. He'd been kidnapped by English explorers years earlier, sold into slavery in Spain, escaped to England, made his way back to North America, and returned to his village only to find everyone dead from disease brought by European traders. The plague had wiped out entire villages along the coast, leaving Squanto one of the few survivors. So when he helped the pilgrims, it wasn't out of naive generosity. It was likely a calculated decision about alliances, trade opportunities, and survival in a landscape that had been devastated by European diseases even before European settlements arrived. The Wampanoag leader Usamiquin, known to the English as Massasoit, had his own reasons for maintaining relations with Plymouth. His people had been weakened by disease, and rival tribes, particularly the Narragansett to the west, posed a threat. An alliance with armed Europeans offered strategic advantages. The harvest celebration was, in many ways, a diplomatic function. 3 days of feasting, political discussions, and trying to figure out if this alliance was going to work. 90 Wampanoag men showed up. 90. For context, there were only 53 colonists total, including women and children. This wasn't a cozy family dinner where the pilgrims graciously invited a few native friends. This was the Wampanoag outnumbering the English nearly 2-1, making a statement about who held power in this relationship. The celebration lasted 3 days, which sounds nice until you remember that these groups didn't fully speak each other's languages, had completely different cultural practices, and were engaged in what amounted to careful negotiation disguised as a party. Imagine 3 days of tense small talk where everyone's armed and one side brought most of the food. There's no record of anyone giving thanks to God during this event, which would have been unusual for the pilgrims if this were actually a religious Thanksgiving. It seems to have been a secular harvest festival, common in both English and Wampanoag cultures. Both groups had traditions of celebrating successful harvests. This was a moment when those traditions briefly overlapped. William Bradford, the Plymouth governor, mentioned the event in his journal, but only in passing. He described the harvest and noted that they sent men out hunting and that Massasoit came with 90 men for 3 days. Edward Winslow wrote a slightly more detailed account, mentioning the deer and fowl and the recreational activities, which apparently included military exercises. Nothing says relaxing feast like demonstrating your weapons capabilities. Neither account suggests this was meant to become an annual tradition. It was a one-time event, notable primarily because the colony hadn't starved to death yet, which was worth celebrating given how close they'd come. The relationship between Plymouth and the Wampanoag would deteriorate over the following decades. As more English settlers arrived, they wanted more land, which meant pushing indigenous peoples out. By 1675, the tensions would erupt into King Philip's War, one of the bloodiest conflicts in American history relative to population. Metacom, Massasoit's son, led a coalition of tribes against the colonists in a desperate attempt to stop English expansion. The war devastated both sides, but indigenous peoples bore the worst of it, with many killed, sold into slavery, or forced to flee. The Thanksgiving story we tell conveniently stops before all of that unpleasantness, freezing the narrative at a moment of tentative cooperation and ignoring the centuries of conflict that followed. The modern Thanksgiving holiday was established much later, during the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln declared a national day of Thanksgiving in 1863. Sarah Josepha Hale, a magazine editor, had been lobbying for a national Thanksgiving holiday for decades, and Lincoln apparently decided that a country tearing itself apart needed something to unify around. The Plymouth Harvest celebration became attached to this holiday retroactively, mythologized into a founding story about pilgrims and Indians sharing a peaceful meal. School pageants reinforced this narrative, with children dressing up in construction paper headdresses and cardboard buckles, acting out a version of history that was more comforting than accurate. The actual complexity, the disease, the decimated villages, the strategic alliances, the eventual wars got smoothed over in favor of a story about cooperation and gratitude. Which isn't to say the 1621 harvest celebration didn't happen or wasn't significant. It did happen, and it was significant. as a moment of tentative peace and mutual benefit. But it wasn't the beginning of an annual tradition. It wasn't primarily about the things we associate with Thanksgiving, and it definitely wasn't the simple story of generous pilgrims and grateful natives that generations of school plays have depicted. It was 3 days of diplomatic eating in the autumn of 1621 between two groups of people trying to figure out how to survive in a world that was changing faster than either of them fully understood. And while they were navigating that complicated relationship in Massachusetts, history was getting ready to judge a group of people in a way that would echo through centuries. The Salem Witch Trials, 1692, Salem, Massachusetts, a place where saying the wrong thing at the wrong time could get you killed, but at least they wouldn't burn you alive, which is something, even if it's a pretty low bar for comfort. Let's start with what didn't happen: mass burnings. Hundreds of people engulfed in flames, dying as spectacles in the town square. That's the image many people have, probably influenced by European witch trials or general confusion about how these things worked. But in Salem, in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, under English law, they didn't burn witches. They hanged them. 19 people were hanged, 14 women and 5 men, between June and September of 1692. One man, Giles Corey, was pressed to death. They laid boards on him and added stones until he was crushed, which happened because he refused to enter a plea. Under English law, if you didn't plead guilty or not guilty, you couldn't be tried, and your property couldn't be confiscated. So Corey just didn't plead. For 3 days, they kept adding weight, and he kept not pleading. His last words were reportedly, "more weight," which is either incredibly brave or incredibly stubborn, depending on how you want to look at it. 20 people total. That's still 20 too many, obviously, but it's nowhere near the hundreds or thousands that people sometimes imagine. The trials lasted about a year, from February 1692 to May 1693, when the governor finally shut the whole thing down after his own wife was accused. Funny how that works. So what actually happened? How does a community go from normal Puritan strictness to executing 20 people for witchcraft in the span of a few months? It started with 2 girls, Betty Paris, 9 years old, and Abigail Williams, 11. They were the daughter and niece of Reverend Samuel Paris. In January of 1692, they started having what people described as fits, screaming, throwing things, contorting their bodies, complaining of being pricked by invisible pins. A doctor examined them and, finding no physical cause, concluded they must be bewitched. Because apparently, that was a legitimate medical diagnosis in 1692. Other girls in Salem Village soon started having similar symptoms. Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, Mary Walcott. The fits spread through the community like a contagion of accusations. The afflicted girls claimed they were being tormented by witches, and they started naming names. The first 3 people accused were Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who'd stopped going to church, and Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Paris household who probably came from Barbados or South America, though records are unclear. The first targets were people on the margins, poor, elderly, enslaved, socially vulnerable. Tituba confessed, which probably saved her life in the short term. She described a conspiracy of witches in vivid detail. A tall man from Boston, a yellow bird, gatherings where witches planned their attacks. Her confession validated everyone's worst fears and kicked the trials into high gear. If there was one witch, there must be more. Start looking. And they did look. Accusations multiplied. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman known for her piety, was accused and eventually hanged, despite strong community support. John Proctor and his wife Elizabeth were both accused. He was hanged. She was spared because she was pregnant. The net kept widening, eventually catching people who were wealthy, respected, even related to the accusers themselves. The trials used spectral evidence, which meant that if an accuser claimed they saw the specter or ghost of the accused tormenting them, that was considered valid testimony. You couldn't defend yourself against your own ghost. If someone said they saw your spirit attacking them in a dream, what were you supposed to say? That wasn't me. That was my evil supernatural doppelganger? The whole system was designed to make defense impossible. There's a theory that gets mentioned a lot: ergot poisoning. Ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and can cause convulsions, hallucinations, and other symptoms that match what the afflicted girls described. The theory suggests that contaminated grain led to mass poisoning, which manifested as these fits. It's an appealing explanation because it removes human agency and blame. Nobody meant for this to happen. They were all just accidentally high on poisoned bread. But historians are skeptical. The symptoms don't quite match. Ergot poisoning causes gangrene and other effects that weren't reported. The fits seemed to come and go conveniently, stopping when the girls were distracted or rewarded, which suggests something more psychological than toxicological. More likely, this was a perfect storm of social tension, religious anxiety, and group psychology. Salem Village was not a happy place in 1692. There were ongoing disputes over the pastor's salary, conflicts between farming families and merchant families, boundary disputes, arguments over church membership. The village was divided, stressed, and looking for explanations for why everything felt like it was falling apart. Add to that the genuine Puritan belief in the reality of Satan and witchcraft. These weren't superstitious fools. They were people living in a worldview where the devil was actively trying to destroy their community, and witches were his willing servants. If something bad happened, livestock died, crops failed, children got sick, supernatural malevolence was a legitimate explanation. The accusations also followed existing social fault lines. Many of the accusers were from farming families aligned with the Putnam clan. Many of the accused were associated with families on the opposite side of village disputes. Witchcraft accusations became a way to settle scores, remove rivals, and consolidate power. The teenage girls at the center of the accusations were in a unique position. Suddenly, after years of being expected to be silent and obedient, they had power. Adults listened to them. Important men asked for their testimony. It's not hard to imagine how that might be difficult to give up, how the attention and influence might become its own motivation to keep the accusations coming. When things finally stopped, the reversal was swift. Increase Mather, one of the most respected ministers in Massachusetts, published a treatise arguing against the use of spectral evidence. The governor dissolved the special court of oyer and terminer that had been conducting the trials. The remaining accused were either acquitted or pardoned. In the aftermath, there was a lot of guilt and very little accountability. Samuel Sewall, one of the judges, eventually issued a public apology. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers, apologized in 1706, claiming she'd been deluded by Satan. The trials left a mark on American consciousness disproportionate to their actual scope. 20 deaths in one small community in 1692 shouldn't necessarily echo through centuries, but they do. Probably because they represent something we recognize: the ease with which fear can override reason, the speed with which communities can turn on their own members, the danger of systems where accusation equals proof. Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, written in 1953, used Salem as an allegory for McCarthyism and the anti-communist hearings, drawing parallels between witch hunts and Red Scares. The play cemented Salem in American cultural memory as a cautionary tale about mass hysteria and the abuse of power. But the real Salem trials weren't a sudden outbreak of madness. They were the result of specific social conditions, theological beliefs, and human choices. People made decisions to accuse, to testify, to condemn. They weren't possessed or poisoned, or temporarily insane. They were people under pressure, acting within a worldview that made witchcraft accusations seem reasonable, even necessary. 20 people died because their community decided they were witches. But 20 is still 20, and each of those deaths represents someone who was condemned by spectral evidence, hanged by the neck until dead, and buried in unmarked graves because, even in death, they couldn't be afforded dignity. The Salem Witch Trials lasted less than a year. The mythology around them has lasted more than 3 centuries, and while we've stopped believing in spectral evidence, the basic dynamic communities turning on scapegoats during times of stress remains depressingly familiar. Though at least now we know that if someone says your ghost attacked them in a dream, that's not admissible evidence. Progress, of a sort, the Civil War's cause, when states' rights meant the right to enslave. 1861. The United States is about to stop being very united. 11 states are going to declare that they're leaving, form their own country, and fight a war that will kill more than 600,000 people. And if you ask why, if you really dig into what the people at the time said they were fighting for, the answer is uncomfortably clear. Slavery. They said it was about slavery. Repeatedly, explicitly, in writing. But that's not the story that got told for decades afterward. Instead, we got the lost cause narrative. The war was about states' rights, tariffs, cultural differences, northern aggression, anything except the enslavement of 4 million human beings. The revisionism started almost immediately after the war ended and persisted well into the 20th century, taught in schools, memorialized in statues, woven into the fabric of American mythology. So let's talk about what the people who actually started the war said they were starting it for. South Carolina seceded first on December 20th, 1860. They issued a Declaration of the Immediate Causes which induce and justify the secession of South Carolina from the federal union. It's very detailed. It lists their grievances, and it's overwhelmingly about slavery. The Declaration complains that northern states have denounced as sinful the institution of slavery. It objects to the election of Abraham Lincoln because his opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. It argues that the constitutional compact has been broken because northern states won't enforce the Fugitive Slave Act, won't return escaped slaves, and have assumed the right of deciding upon the propriety of our domestic institutions. Mississippi's declaration is even more direct. Second sentence. Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. They're not being subtle. They continue. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. Georgia's declaration similarly focuses on slavery, arguing that the North has been waging a war on slavery, and that Lincoln's election represents the triumph of those who seek slavery's destruction. Texas mentions slavery more than 20 times in their declaration. They describe African Americans as an inferior and dependent race, and argue that keeping them enslaved is both economically necessary and divinely ordained. Alexander Stephens, Vice President of the Confederacy, gave a speech in March 1861 that came to be known as the Cornerstone Speech. In it, he explicitly rejected the idea that all men are created equal and stated that the Confederacy's foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests, upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. That's pretty clear. The Vice President of the Confederacy said the cornerstone of their government was slavery and racial inequality, not tariffs, not states' rights as an abstract principle, slavery. But after the war, as former Confederate leaders tried to rebuild their political power and social status, the narrative shifted. They couldn't openly celebrate slavery anymore they'd lost, and public opinion had turned against the institution, at least officially. So they reframed the war as being about states' rights, about constitutional principles, about defending Southern culture and honor. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate campaign to rehabilitate the Confederate cause and maintain white supremacy through other means. If they could convince people the war wasn't really about slavery, then they could avoid the moral condemnation that came with having fought to preserve it. The states' rights argument has some truth to it, in that Confederates were arguing for the right of states to decide their own policies without federal interference. But the specific right they were most concerned about was the right to maintain slavery. When they talked about states' rights, they meant the right to own people. It's not an abstract constitutional debate. It's a euphemism. Here's the irony. Confederate states weren't even consistent about states' rights. The Confederate Constitution, adopted in March 1861, actually prohibited member states from abolishing slavery. Individual states couldn't decide to end slavery even if they wanted to. So much for states deciding their own policies. Similarly, before the war, Southern states had been perfectly happy with federal power when it worked in their favor. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was a federal law that forced Northern states to return escaped slaves, overriding their own state laws and policies. Southern states supported this enthusiastically. They only developed concerns about federal overreach when that power started working against slavery. The tariff argument doesn't hold up much better. Yes, there were disputes over tariffs, particularly the Tariff of Abominations in 1828 and subsequent debates. But by 1860, tariff rates had been reduced, and they weren't a major point of contention. Secession declarations barely mentioned tariffs, spending far more time discussing slavery. Lincoln's election was the immediate trigger for secession. Southern leaders saw this as evidence that they'd lost control of the federal government permanently. The demographic and economic trends were against them. Free states were growing faster than slave states, and it was only a matter of time before they'd have the political power to restrict or abolish slavery. Lincoln himself had said he wouldn't interfere with slavery where it already existed, only prevent its expansion into new territories. But Southern leaders didn't believe him, or didn't think that was enough. New free states would be admitted, free state populations would grow, and eventually they'd have the votes to amend the Constitution and abolish slavery everywhere. So they seceded. 7 states left before Lincoln even took office. 4 more joined after the attack on Fort Sumter in April 1861. They formed the Confederate States of America, elected Jefferson Davis as president, and prepared for war. The war itself was devastating. 620,000 to 750,000 dead, depending on which estimate you use. That's about 2% of the entire U.S. population at the time. Adjusted for today's population, it would be equivalent to 6 or 7 million deaths. Whole regiments were wiped out in single battles. Families lost multiple sons. The South's economy and infrastructure were destroyed. And it was all to preserve an institution that was not only morally indefensible but economically obsolete. Slavery was already becoming less profitable and less sustainable. Industrialization was making free labor more efficient in most contexts. The rest of the Western world was abolishing slavery. Brazil would do so in 1888, making it the last country in the Americas to abolish the practice. The Confederacy fought and lost a war to defend something that was dying anyway, and in the process, they destroyed themselves more thoroughly than their enemies ever could have. Sherman's March to the Sea, the burning of Atlanta, the devastation of Virginia, none of it had to happen. If Southern states had accepted Lincoln's election and worked within the political system, slavery might have lasted another generation before economic and moral pressures ended it. Instead, they chose secession and war, and slavery ended after 4 years of unimaginable carnage. But the lost cause narrative persisted. Confederate monuments went up decades after the war, during periods of civil rights activism, sending a message about who held power and whose version of history would be told. Textbooks taught that the war was about states' rights and that enslaved people were mostly content with their condition. The mythology of the genteel plantations south, of noble lost cause, of tragic heroes fighting for their homeland, it all served to obscure what the war was actually about. We're still dealing with the consequences of that revisionism. Debates over monuments, over how to teach the Civil War, over whether to call it the Civil War or the war between the states. These aren't academic disputes. They're arguments about historical truth and moral responsibility. The people who started the Civil War told us why they did it. They wrote it down. They gave speeches. They were very clear. And what they said was slavery. The right to own other human beings, to treat them as property, to build an economy and society on their forced labor. Everything else, states, rights, tariffs, cultural differences, was window dressing, either during the war or added afterward to make the cause seem more palatable. Sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one, and sometimes people tell you exactly what they mean if you just listen. And speaking of documents that didn't actually do what people think they did, the Emancipation Proclamation. Freedom with fine print, January 1st, 1863. Abraham Lincoln signs a document that, in the popular imagination, freed all the slaves. Except it didn't. Not even close. The Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people in states that were in rebellion against the United States. Which sounds great, except Lincoln had no actual power to enforce that in Confederate territory. Meanwhile, enslaved people in border states that had remained loyal to the Union, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, remained enslaved, as did enslaved people in parts of Confederate states that had already been captured by Union forces. So the proclamation freed enslaved people where Lincoln couldn't free them, and left them enslaved where he could have freed them. It's like announcing you're canceling a debt for people who live on Mars. Technically generous, practically useless, but that's not quite fair. Because the proclamation did accomplish several important things, even if immediately freeing 4 million enslaved people wasn't one of them. First, context. Lincoln had been elected in 1860, and his position on slavery was more nuanced than people sometimes realize. He believed slavery was morally wrong. He also believed the federal government didn't have the constitutional authority to abolish it in states where it already existed. His plan was to prevent slavery's expansion into new territories, gradually strangle it economically, and let it die over time. The Civil War changed the calculation. By 1862, the war wasn't going well for the Union. Casualties were mounting, costs were exploding, and European powers were considering recognizing the Confederacy. Lincoln needed to change the war's character to make it explicitly about slavery rather than just preserving the Union. There was also the practical matter that enslaved people were escaping to Union lines in increasing numbers. Thousands of them, seeking freedom, offering to work for the Union, asking what the war was even about, if not their liberation. Union commanders didn't know what to do with them. Some returned them to slaveholders. Some employed them as laborers. Some armed them. There was no consistent policy. The Emancipation Proclamation created a policy. As of January 1st, 1863, enslaved people in Confederate territory were declared free. This meant that, as Union armies advanced, they would be liberating people, not just conquering territory. It meant that enslaved people who escaped to Union lines were legally free, not fugitives to be returned. It also meant that black men could officially enlist in the Union Army. They'd been trying to enlist since the war started, and some commanders had accepted them despite official policy prohibiting it. Now it was official. By the end of the war, roughly 180,000 black men had served in the Union Army, about 10% of the total force. Their service would be crucial to Union victory. The proclamation was a military measure. issued under Lincoln's authority as commander-in-chief. This was important because it meant he could do it without Congress, which might not have supported it, but it also meant the proclamation was legally shaky. It was a war measure, justified by military necessity. What happened after the war ended? Would it still be valid? Could it be overturned? Lincoln knew this. That's why he pushed for the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery constitutionally and permanently. The amendment passed Congress in January 1865 and was ratified by the states in December 1865, 8 months after Lincoln's assassination. The 13th Amendment is what actually ended slavery in the United States. The Emancipation Proclamation was a significant step, a symbolic statement, and a practical military measure, but it wasn't the final word. And those border states that got to keep their slaves? They lost them anyway, through various means. Missouri abolished slavery by state constitution in January 1865. Maryland did it in November 1864. Delaware and Kentucky held out until the 13th Amendment forced the issue, so the proclamation's immediate practical effect was limited. But its symbolic and political effects were enormous. It transformed the Civil War from a conflict about preserving the Union into a war about human freedom. It made Confederate defeat synonymous with slavery's abolition. It aligned the Union cause with moral progress, making European recognition of the Confederacy less likely. It also terrified Southern slaveholders, who feared slave rebellions now that freedom had been promised. Those rebellions largely didn't happen, partly because enslaved people had their own calculations about when and how to seek freedom, partly because many were waiting to see if the proclamation would be enforced. But as Union armies advanced, freedom followed. Enslaved people fled plantations and headed for Union lines. Some picked up weapons and joined the fight. Others worked as laborers, guides, scouts, and spies. Their contributions to their own liberation were substantial, even if the official narrative often credits only Lincoln and the Union Army. Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved abolitionist and writer, had been pushing Lincoln to make emancipation a war aim since 1861. He saw the proclamation as inadequate but necessary a step forward, even if not far enough. He wrote, "We are all liberated by this proclamation. Everybody is liberated. When still this forkin out, well he open information. The white man is liberated, the black man is liberated. The brave men now fighting the battles of their country against rebels and traitors are now liberated." That might be overstating it. But Douglass understood what Lincoln was doing, using the legal and moral authority of the presidency to declare that the United States stood for freedom, however, incompletely. Lincoln himself understood the proclamation's limitations. In a letter to Salmon Chase, he wrote about the necessity of following up with constitutional abolition. In his last public speech, on April 11, 1865, he spoke about Reconstruction and the need to extend voting rights to black men, at least those who'd served in the military or were literate. It was radical for the time. 3 days later, John Wilkes Booth shot him. The mythology around the Emancipation Proclamation is understandable. We want our history to have clear turning points, decisive moments when great leaders did great things. Lincoln's signing the proclamation fits that narrative. It's visual, dramatic, morally clear. The reality is messier. The proclamation was a military order, with significant exceptions, issued in the middle of a war, with uncertain legal standing and incomplete immediate effect. It was part of a process, not the culmination of one. Freedom came gradually, through military victory, legislative action, constitutional amendment, and the efforts of enslaved people themselves. But it mattered. It changed how Americans understood the war. It gave Union forces a moral purpose beyond just preserving territorial integrity. It opened the door for black military service, which helped win the war and established a claim to citizenship rights afterward. It moved the nation, haltingly and incompletely, toward actually living up to its founding claims about equality and liberty. Just not on January 1st, 1863. Not all at once. Not completely. History rarely works that neatly. And speaking of historical realities being messier than the mythology suggests, let's head west. The Wild West. Where gun control was stricter than today. The Wild West. Just saying those words probably conjures images. Dusty main streets, swinging saloon doors, cowboys squaring off at high noon, guns blazing, bodies dropping, lawlessness as far as the eye can see, tumbleweeds rolling past the corpses. Except, that's not really what the West was like. Not most of it, anyway. Not most of the time. The American frontier between roughly 1850 and 1900 was certainly rough. People died from disease, accidents, childbirth complications, infected wounds that would be easily treatable today. Life was hard. But the Hollywood version of constant gunfights and lawless violence, that's more fiction than fact. Created largely by dime novels, Wild West shows, and later, movies and television. Let's start with gun laws. Because this might surprise you. Many frontier towns had stricter gun control than most American cities do today. Dodge City, Tombstone, Deadwood. These legendary Wild West towns required visitors to check their guns with the sheriff upon entering town. You could keep your gun at home or at your hotel, but you couldn't carry it on the street. Tombstone, Arizona, home of the famous gunfight at the O.K. Corral, had an ordinance that stated, to carry firearms in the city limits without first depositing them with the marshal is strictly forbidden. That's what the famous gunfight was actually about. The Earp brothers, serving as lawmen, were trying to enforce gun control laws against the Clanton-McLaury gang, who'd ridden into town armed. The gunfight itself lasted about 30 seconds. 3 men died. It was over almost before it started, and it became famous precisely because it was unusual. If shootouts had been a daily occurrence in Tombstone, nobody would have remembered this particular one. But it was shocking and dramatic enough that people talked about it, wrote about it, and eventually mythologized it into a defining moment of the Wild West. Dodge City, Kansas, another legendary frontier town, had similar laws. The Dodge City Times in 1878 advised, people should use the sidewalks and leave their six-shooters at home. Records show that between 1876 and 1885, Dodge City averaged about 1.5 homicides per year. For context, the modern U.S. homicide rate is about 5 per 100,000 people. Dodge City's rate, adjusted for its small population, was higher, but not astronomically so. Deadwood, South Dakota, site of Wild Bill Hickok's death, had its share of violence in its early days as a gold rush town. But even there, murder rates dropped quickly once law enforcement was established. Hickok himself was shot from behind while playing poker in 1876, notable precisely because he was a famous gunfighter and lawman who died in such an unheroic way. The Billy the Kid legend is interesting to examine. William H. Bonney, known as Billy the Kid, was involved in the Lincoln County War in New Mexico Territory in the late 1870s. He was credited with killing 21 men by age 21, which made for a neat headline. The actual number was probably closer to 4 to 9, depending on which historians you trust and whether you count participants in group shootings. He was caught and sentenced to hang in 1881. He escaped, killing 2 deputies in the process. Pat Garrett, the sheriff, tracked him down and shot him at age 21. The kid became famous partly because he died young and partly because newspaper coverage mythologized him. Dime novels about his exploits appeared almost immediately after his death, each more exaggerated than the last. Jesse James, another famous outlaw, led a gang that robbed banks and trains after the Civil War. He was shot in the back of the head by Robert Ford in 1882, a member of his own gang, hoping for reward money. He'd been robbing places for about 16 years, which seems like a long criminal career. But context matters. During the Civil War, he'd ridden with Quantrill's Raiders, a Confederate guerrilla group. After the war, former Confederates faced discrimination and poverty. Some turned to outlawry, partly from desperation, partly from continued resistance to federal authority. The West wasn't lawless, but law enforcement was spotty and inconsistent. Towns and mining camps would spring up quickly, sometimes without formal government structures. Initially, there might be no official law enforcement, and communities would rely on informal justice, vigilance committees, or just avoiding troublemakers. But as soon as a settlement became permanent, one of the first things established was usually some form of law enforcement and court system. Most frontier homicides weren't dramatic gunfights at all. They were alcohol-fueled arguments, domestic disputes, robberies gone wrong, or personal grudges settled with violence. They looked a lot like violence in any other time and place, just with period-appropriate weapons. Actual quick-draw duels, like in the movies, were extremely rare. Most real gunfights involved people shooting from behind cover, often while drunk, frequently missing their targets entirely. The Earp Clanton gunfight is notable partly because it happened in the open, in daylight, with multiple participants on each side. Here's something else that doesn't fit the mythology. Many famous lawmen were also criminals at various points. Wyatt Earp was arrested for horse theft in 1871. Bat Masterson worked as a lawman but also as a gambler and saloon owner, occupations that weren't always clearly legal. The line between lawman and outlaw could be surprisingly thin, depending on who was in power and what they decided to enforce. The cowboy lifestyle itself was less glamorous than depicted. Cowboys were essentially migrant laborers who herded cattle from ranches to railheads. The work was dirty, dangerous, poorly paid, and seasonal. Most cowboys were young men who did the work for a few years before moving on to something else. They weren't gunfighters or outlaws. They were hired hands. The great cattle drives that defined the cowboy era lasted only about 20 years, from roughly 1866 to 1886. After that, railroads and barbed wire changed the economics of cattle ranching. The open range disappeared. The cowboy as a cultural figure outlasted the actual profession by decades. Native American conflicts in the West were real and often brutal, but they're usually portrayed completely one-sidedly. The U.S. government systematically violated treaties, seized land, and forced tribes onto reservations. Native peoples fought back, sometimes winning battles like Little Bighorn in 1876, where Lakota and Cheyenne forces wiped out Custer's battalion, but they were fighting against overwhelming numerical and technological advantages. By 1890, the Indian Wars were effectively over, with Native peoples confined to reservations and their traditional ways of life destroyed. The myths about the Wild West started forming almost immediately. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, which toured from 1883 through the early 1900s, presented a romanticized version of frontier life with trick shooting, staged gunfights, and dramatic reenactments. It was entertainment, but it shaped how Americans understood their own recent history. Dime novels, cheap sensational fiction, churned out stories about heroic lawmen and daring outlaws. These books sold millions of copies, creating legends that bore little resemblance to reality. Ned Buntline's stories about Buffalo Bill turned a scout and showman into a superhuman hero. The facts were boring. The fiction sold. Early Western movies in the 1910s and 20s codified the imagery. The good guy in a white hat, the villain in black, the damsel in distress, the climactic shootout. John Ford's films, particularly those starring John Wayne, established visual and narrative conventions that persist today. By the 1950s, Westerns dominated television, with shows like Gunsmoke and Bonanza presenting weekly tales of frontier justice. The irony is that the West was being mythologized even as it was disappearing. By the time the first Western movies were made, the frontier was already closed. The Census Bureau declared in 1890 that there was no longer a clear frontier line. The West was being settled, fenced, incorporated into states. The era being depicted was already history, so why did the myth persist? Americans wanted to believe in a time when things were simpler, when good and evil were clear, when individual courage and quick wits mattered more than social connections or education. The Western offered a fantasy of self-reliance and moral clarity that contrasted with the complexity of modern industrial society. It also served political purposes. The myth of the Wild West justified westward expansion, portrayed settlers as heroes taming wilderness, and marginalized Native Americans as obstacles to progress, rather than peoples defending their homes. It was easier to celebrate conquest if you could frame it as civilizing lawless territory rather than seizing inhabited land. The real West was more complicated and less dramatic. Most people weren't gunfighters or outlaws. They were farmers, shopkeepers, miners, railroad workers, prostitutes, laundry workers, and yes, cowboys. They worked hard, dealt with harsh conditions, tried to build lives in challenging circumstances. Some succeeded, many failed, most just got by. Violence happened, but it wasn't constant. Most frontier communities wanted peace and stability because chaos is bad for business. They established laws, built churches and schools, created the institutions of civil society as quickly as they could. The Wild West wasn't some anarchic free-for-all. It was a society in transition, figuring out how to govern itself, sometimes succeeding, sometimes failing, but always trying. And many of those frontier towns had stricter gun laws than modern America, which is perhaps the most ironic legacy of the Wild West. The place we associate with everyone having a gun actually tried harder to keep guns out of public spaces than we do today. But if you're looking for dramatic events that did shape the nation, there's always economic catastrophe. The Great Depression, when everything broke at once. October 29th, 1929. Black Tuesday. The stock market crashes, fortunes evaporate overnight, and the Great Depression begins. Except that's not quite right. The stock market crash didn't cause the depression. It was more like the moment when everyone realized how bad things already were. Let's back up, because understanding the Great Depression requires understanding the 1920s, which were, for some people, actually pretty great. The Roaring Twenties, they called it. Economic growth, technological innovation, cultural dynamism, jazz music, flappers, speakeasies, cars, radios, movies. For urban middle and upper classes, it was a time of prosperity and optimism. But underneath the prosperity, there were problems. Serious, structural problems that nobody seemed particularly interested in addressing. First, agriculture. Farmers had expanded production during World War I to feed both America and Europe. After the war, European agriculture recovered and demand dropped. American farmers were producing more than the market needed, which drove down prices. Lower prices meant lower income, which meant farmers couldn't pay their debts. Rural banks, which had loaned money to farmers, started failing. Throughout the 1920s, rural America was already in depression. Second, income inequality. The 1920s saw tremendous economic growth, but the benefits were distributed unevenly. The top 1% of Americans saw their income rise by 75% during the decade. Meanwhile, wages for most workers stayed relatively flat. Consumer spending drove the economy. Installment plans for everything from cars to refrigerators to furniture. People went into debt to buy things, sustaining demand artificially. Third, speculation. Stock prices rose throughout the 1920s, faster than company earnings justified. People bought stocks on margin, borrowing money to invest, betting that prices would keep rising. As long as they did, everyone made money. Brokers loaned to speculators, banks loaned to brokers. Everyone assumed the good times would continue forever. Fourth, banking instability. The U.S. had thousands of small banks, many of them poorly capitalized and poorly regulated. There was no deposit insurance. If a bank failed, depositors lost everything. This created incentives for bank runs. If you heard a bank might be in trouble, you'd rush to withdraw your money before everyone else did, which would cause the bank to fail even if it had been solvent before the run started. Fifth, international economic fragility. World War I had destroyed European economies. Germany was crushed by reparation payments. Britain and France owed huge war debts to the United States. International trade was hampered by tariffs and currency instability. The global economy was interconnected but poorly managed, with no international institutions to coordinate policy or provide stability. All of these problems existed before October 1929. The stock market crash just made them visible simultaneously. The crash itself unfolded over several days. October 24th, Black Thursday, saw heavy selling and a sharp drop in prices. Bankers pooled money to buy stocks and stabilize the market. It worked, briefly. Then Monday and Tuesday hit. October 28th and 29th saw panic selling. Prices collapsed. Fortunes disappeared. Some people jumped out of windows, though probably fewer than popular legend suggests. More commonly, they just sat in stunned disbelief, watching their portfolios become worthless. Margin calls wiped out speculators who'd borrowed to invest. The paper wealth of the 1920s evaporated. But the crash alone didn't cause the depression. Stock market losses primarily affected the wealthy and middle classes who owned stocks. Most Americans didn't own stocks. What turned a market crash into a national catastrophe was the cascade of failures that followed. Banks failed. Between 1930 and 1933, roughly 9,000 banks went under, taking their depositors' savings with them. People who'd never owned a stock suddenly lost everything they'd saved, through no fault of their own. Businesses failed. Consumption collapsed as people, uncertain about the future, stopped spending. Businesses, unable to sell their products, laid off workers. Unemployed workers had even less money to spend, which caused more businesses to fail, which created more unemployment. It was a vicious cycle with no obvious way out. Unemployment reached 25% by 1933. In some cities, it was higher. 1 in 4 workers couldn't find a job. Those lucky enough to have jobs often had their hours or wages cut. Families lost their homes, couldn't afford food, stood in bread lines, lived in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, named mockingly after President Herbert Hoover. Agriculture got worse. Prices for farm products fell even further. Farmers couldn't pay their mortgages and lost their land. Drought in the early 1930s turned much of the Great Plains into the Dust Bowl, forcing hundreds of thousands of families to abandon their farms and migrate west looking for work. President Hoover's response was inadequate. He believed in limited government intervention, trusted that the economy would self-correct, and worried that federal aid would create dependency. He did take some actions encouraging businesses not to cut wages, establishing the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to loan money to banks and businesses, but it wasn't enough. The economy continued to deteriorate. Franklin Roosevelt was elected in 1932, promising a New Deal for Americans. He took office in March 1933, with the country in crisis. Banks were failing so fast that many states had declared bank holidays, closing banks temporarily to prevent runs. Roosevelt declared a national bank holiday, closing all banks, then worked with Congress to pass emergency legislation, shoring up the banking system and creating federal deposit insurance. The New Deal encompassed dozens of programs: public works projects to create jobs, agricultural subsidies to raise farm prices, securities regulation to prevent another stock market crash, Social Security to provide a safety net for the elderly and disabled. Some programs worked better than others. Some were later declared unconstitutional. But collectively, they represented the most aggressive peacetime expansion of federal power in American history. Did the New Deal end the Depression? Debatable. Unemployment remained high throughout the 1930s. The economy improved, then crashed again in 1937. What finally ended the Depression was World War II, which required massive government spending, full employment, and industrial production on an unprecedented scale. By 1943, unemployment was essentially gone. Though millions of workers were in military service or defense industries rather than their chosen professions, the Depression left scars. A generation of Americans grew up with memories of poverty, insecurity, and hardship. They developed habits of frugality and caution that persisted for decades. The phrase "depression mentality" described people who hoarded, reused, avoided debt, and never fully trusted banks or the stock market again. It also fundamentally changed American politics and government. Before the Depression, the federal government played a relatively limited role in the economy. After the Depression, Americans expected the government to manage the economy, prevent unemployment, provide social insurance, and intervene during crises. The Great Depression wasn't caused by a single event. It resulted from structural problems in agriculture, banking, income distribution, and international economics, combined with speculation and inadequate policy responses. The stock market crash was the trigger. But the gun had been loaded for years. Understanding this matters because it means another depression isn't impossible. If we recreate similar conditions, extreme inequality, financial instability, inadequate regulation, international economic fragility, we could face similar consequences. The specific mechanisms might differ, but the underlying dynamics of cascading failures remain relevant. The Depression teaches us that markets aren't self-correcting, that inequality has economic consequences, that financial speculation can turn destructive, and that government has a role in preventing and mitigating economic catastrophes. These aren't political statements. They're historical observations based on what happened when we got those things wrong. But if you think economic crashes make people paranoid, just wait until someone attacks your country. Pearl Harbor. The surprise. That wasn't quite. December 7th, 1941. A date which will live in infamy. Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, sinking or damaging 8 battleships, destroying aircraft, killing over 2,000 Americans. The United States enters World War II the next day. It was a surprise attack. Strategically successful, tactically brilliant, and devastating. But was America completely blindsided? Did nobody see it coming? Was there a conspiracy to let it happen? The answers are no, no, and no. But the truth is complicated enough that conspiracy theories persist. Let's start with context. Relations between the United States and Japan had been deteriorating for years. Japan had invaded China in 1937, conducting brutal warfare that killed millions. The U.S. opposed Japanese expansion, imposing economic sanctions and trade restrictions. In July 1941, after Japan occupied French Indochina, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and imposed an oil embargo. This was devastating for Japan, which imported 80% of its oil from the U.S. Without oil, Japan's military couldn't function. Japanese leaders faced a choice: withdraw from China and submit to U.S. demands, or go to war to seize oil resources in Southeast Asia. They chose war. But attacking British and Dutch colonies in Southeast Asia would likely provoke an American response anyway. So they decided to strike first, cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and buy time to consolidate their conquests before America could respond. U.S. Intelligence knew war was likely. They'd broken Japanese diplomatic codes through a program called Magic. They could read encrypted messages between Tokyo and Japanese diplomats. Throughout 1941, these messages showed Japan preparing for war. In late November, the U.S. sent war warnings to Pacific commanders. On November 27th, Admiral Husband Kimmel in Pearl Harbor and General Walter Short in Hawaii received messages warning that hostile action was possible. Short was told to undertake reconnaissance and other measures, but to avoid alarming the civilian population. But, and this is crucial, nobody knew where or when Japan would strike. Intelligence suggested attacks on the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. These were closer to Japan, more strategically important for access to resources, and seemed like more logical targets. Pearl Harbor seemed unlikely. It was thousands of miles from Japan across open ocean. Launching an attack required a massive fleet to approach undetected, which seemed nearly impossible. Most analysts thought Hawaii was too far, too difficult, too risky. They were wrong. Admiral Yamamoto had planned exactly such an attack, keeping radio silence, choosing a route across the northern Pacific, where surveillance was minimal, timing the attack for a Sunday morning when ships would be in harbor and defenses relaxed. On the morning of December 7th, a radar station on Oahu detected aircraft approaching from the north. The operators reported it to the information center, where a lieutenant, seeing the radar contact, assumed it was a flight of B-17 bombers expected from California. He told them not to worry about it. This is the kind of intelligence failure that haunts analysts forever. The warning was received, but misinterpreted. Training, procedures, and assumptions all failed simultaneously. The attack began at 7:55 a.m. Two waves of Japanese aircraft bombers, torpedo planes, fighters struck airfields and ships. Most American aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Ships were torpedoed and bombed, many capsizing or burning. The USS Arizona exploded when a bomb penetrated its magazine, killing over 1,000 men. The Utah, Oklahoma, and West Virginia sank. Other ships were damaged. American forces fought back as best they could. Some pilots managed to get aircraft airborne. Anti-aircraft gunners engaged enemy planes, but they were overwhelmed, unprepared, and caught completely off guard. By 10 a.m., it was over. 8 battleships sunk or damaged, 3 cruisers damaged, 3 destroyers damaged, over 180 aircraft destroyed, 2,403 Americans dead, including 68 civilians, over 1,000 wounded. Japan lost 29 aircraft, 5 midget submarines, and about 100 men. Tactically, it was a stunning success. Strategically, it was a disaster for Japan. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was damaged but not destroyed. Crucially, the aircraft carriers were at sea during the attack and escaped harm. Pearl Harbor's repair facilities and oil storage tanks were mostly undamaged. More importantly, the attack unified American public opinion. Before Pearl Harbor, Americans were divided about entering the war. Isolationists argued for staying out of European and Asian conflicts. After Pearl Harbor, unity was nearly total. Congress declared war with only one dissenting vote. Millions volunteered for military service. Industry mobilized for war production. The sleeping giant, as Yamamoto allegedly said, was awakened. So, was it a conspiracy? Did Roosevelt know and let it happen to create an excuse for war? No. Multiple investigations, including ones with access to classified information, found no evidence of foreknowledge. The intelligence failures were real, but resulted from human error, not malice. Could it have been prevented? Possibly. If someone had correctly interpreted the radar sighting, if someone had recognized the pattern of Japanese preparations, if someone had guessed that Pearl Harbor was the target, defenses might have been better prepared. But fog of war, incomplete information, and reasonable assumptions about Japanese capabilities all contributed to failure. This happens in intelligence work. You have pieces of information that only make sense in retrospect. You have false positives and noise-obscuring signals. You have analysts making judgments based on incomplete data. Sometimes you're right. Sometimes you're catastrophically wrong. After Pearl Harbor, the U.S. overhauled its intelligence systems. Better coordination between agencies, improved analysis, more systematic collection, and dissemination of information. But even with improvements, intelligence failures still happen. They're part of warfare's inherent uncertainty. The attack on Pearl Harbor brought America into World War II, which would ultimately result in 50 to 85 million deaths worldwide and reshape global politics for generations. Japan's gamble failed. The U.S. industrial capacity, once mobilized, overwhelmed Japanese forces. By August 1945, Japan surrendered after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Pearl Harbor lives in American memory as a symbol of treachery and the dangers of unpreparedness. Remember, Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry throughout the war. The attack established December 7th as a day of remembrance, marked annually with ceremonies and reflection. But it wasn't a complete surprise in the sense that nobody saw trouble coming. War with Japan was expected. The specific target and timing were surprises, but that's different from being blindsided by a completely unforeseen attack. And there's no evidence of conspiracy, just human fallibility during a time of uncertainty and stress. Which, it turns out, also explains the next event people love to conspiracize about, the Roswell incident. When weather balloons become UFOs. July 1947. Roswell, New Mexico. Something crashes on a ranch about 75 miles northwest of town. A rancher named Mac Brazel finds debris scattered across his property: sticks, foil, rubber, and paper. He's confused enough about it that he drives into town and reports it to the sheriff, who contacts the nearby Roswell Army airfield. The military sends someone to investigate. They collect the debris, and then, in what might be the worst public relations decision in military history, they issue a press release saying they've recovered a flying disc. The Roswell Daily Record runs with it. ROV captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. This is July 8, 1947. Flying saucers are having a moment. Just 2 weeks earlier, pilot Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 unusual objects near Mount Rainier, describing their movement as like a saucer skipping across water. The press coined the term flying saucer, and suddenly everyone was seeing them. But back to Roswell. The military's flying disc announcement lasts about 1 day before they walk it back. Never mind, they say. It was actually a weather balloon. The debris is from a weather balloon. Nothing to see here. And for about 30 years, people did move along. The incident was mostly forgotten. A minor footnote in the summer of flying saucer reports. Then, in the late 1970s, UFO researchers started interviewing witnesses and writing books. The story grew. It wasn't just debris anymore. It was an alien spacecraft. There were bodies. Small, gray beings with large heads and black eyes. The military had recovered them and hidden everything at a secret facility. Probably Area 51. Definitely a cover-up. By the 1990s, Roswell had become synonymous with UFO conspiracy theories. Books, documentaries, TV shows. The town itself leaned into it, putting up alien-themed street lamps and opening UFO museums. Every year, a UFO festival draws thousands of people. It's good for tourism, whatever the truth. So, what actually happened? Let's talk about Project Mogul. In 1947, the Cold War was just beginning. The Soviet Union had detonated its first nuclear weapon, yet that would happen in 1949, earlier than the US expected. The US military wanted to monitor Soviet nuclear tests, but how do you detect an explosion on the other side of the world? One approach was acoustic monitoring. Nuclear explosions create low-frequency sound waves that travel through the atmosphere. If you could position sensitive microphones at high altitude, you might be able to detect those sounds from thousands of miles away. Project Mogul was a classified program to do exactly that. They launched high-altitude balloons, carrying microphones and transmitters. The balloons were made of polyethylene, a then new material. They were large, up to 600 feet long, when fully inflated. They carried instrument packages that dangled below on long trains of balloons, radar targets, and sensors. The radar targets were particularly distinctive. They were made of balsa wood sticks covered with foil-like radar-reflective material, forming geometric shapes. When one of these contraptions crashed, you'd find sticks, foil, rubber from the balloons, and various other materials that might look unusual if you didn't know what you were looking at. On June 4, 1947, Project Mogul launched Flight Number 4 from Alamogordo Army Airfield, about 80 miles from Roswell. They tracked it as it drifted northeast, then lost contact. Based on wind patterns and trajectory, researchers have calculated that Flight 4 would have come down right about where Mac Brazel found his debris field. The materials Brazel described, the sticks, the foil, the rubber match Project Mogul materials, the timeline matches, the location matches. In the 1990s, the Air Force released reports confirming this. They declassified Project Mogul, explained what it was, showed how the debris matched, and demonstrated that this was the source of the Roswell incident. They even explained the alien bodies. In the early 1950s, the Air Force conducted high-altitude parachute tests using anthropomorphic dummies. These dummies were about the size of a small person, had somewhat humanoid shapes, and were recovered after being dropped from aircraft or high-altitude balloons. Some of these tests happened near Roswell. The Air Force's theory is that witnesses, remembering events from decades earlier, conflated the 1947 debris recovery with these later dummy recoveries, creating false memories of bodies associated with the original incident. This is actually well documented in psychology. Memory is reconstructive, and people combine different memories, especially over long time periods. But UFO believers aren't satisfied with this explanation. They point to witnesses who claim they saw alien bodies in 1947, not the 1950s. They argue that the government would say anything to cover up the truth. They suggest that Project Mogul is itself a cover story, or that there were two crashes, one weather balloon, one alien craft. The problem with conspiracy theories is that they're unfalsifiable. Government documents? Fabricated. Expert testimony? They're in on it. Scientific analysis? Part of the conspiracy. You can't prove something didn't happen to someone who's committed to believing it did. Let's consider what would actually be required for the Roswell incident to be an alien spacecraft. First, the craft would need to exist. Aliens capable of interstellar travel would need to have visited Earth. Second, it would need to crash in New Mexico. Fourth, they'd need to keep it secret for over 75 years, despite involving hundreds or thousands of people in the recovery, analysis, and cover-up. Fifth, none of those people would provide convincing evidence, despite strong incentives to do so. Fame, money, historical significance. Meanwhile, the alternative explanation requires only that a classified balloon program crashed. The military initially misidentified it publicly before correcting themselves, and decades later, people conflated memories and created mythology around the event. Occam's razor, the principle that simpler explanations are generally more likely, strongly favors the balloon explanation. But Roswell persists in popular culture because people want to believe. The idea that we're not alone in the universe is compelling. The notion that the government has proof of alien life but is hiding it is exciting. It makes reality seem more interesting, more mysterious, more significant than the alternative, which is that we're still searching for extraterrestrial life and haven't found convincing evidence yet. The Roswell incident also fits into broader narratives about government secrecy and distrust. The 1940s through 60s saw the government conduct secret programs, nuclear testing, biological experiments, surveillance operations that were later revealed and criticized. This created legitimate reasons to question official explanations. If they lied about other things, maybe they're lying about Roswell. But the existence of some government deception doesn't mean all conspiracy theories are true. You have to evaluate each claim on its own merits, based on available evidence. The evidence for Roswell being an alien spacecraft is witness testimony from decades later. The evidence for it being Project Mogul is matching materials, matching timeline, matching location, declassified documents, and scientific analysis. One of these is significantly more convincing than the other. There's also a broader point about UFO sightings generally. Most turn out to be aircraft, satellites, planets, atmospheric phenomena, or various other mundane explanations. Some remain unidentified, which doesn't mean they're alien spacecraft, it just means we don't know what they were. The US government has actually released videos of unidentified aerial phenomena encountered by military pilots. These show objects moving in ways that seem unusual. The Pentagon has acknowledged they don't know what these objects are. This is interesting and worth investigating, but we don't know what that isn't the same as it's aliens. Scientists are actively searching for extraterrestrial life through programs like SETI, which monitors radio signals for signs of intelligent communication. They're studying exoplanets to determine which might be habitable. They're analyzing Mars for signs of past microbial life. If aliens exist and we can find evidence of them, scientists want to find it. There's no conspiracy to hide extraterrestrial life, there'd be Nobel Prizes for discovering it. The Roswell incident is a case study in how myths develop. A mundane event, a classified balloon crashes, gets misreported. The correction seems suspicious. Decades later, UFO researchers reconstruct the story with embellishments. Witnesses' memories become unreliable over time. Popular culture amplifies the myth. Eventually, the myth becomes more culturally significant than the reality. But the reality, boring as it might be, is that what crashed in Roswell was almost certainly a high-altitude balloon from Project Mogul, designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests. It was classified, which is why the military acted strangely. It used unusual materials, which is why the debris seemed weird, and it became a UFO legend, because humans love mysteries, conspiracies, and the possibility that we're not alone in the universe. Sometimes a weather balloon is just a weather balloon. And speaking of things that sound cooler than they were, but were actually exactly as cool as they sound, let's talk about the moon. The moon landing. When humanity left Earth, and people stopped believing it. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong steps off the lunar module Eagle onto the surface of the moon. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Except, he probably said, a man. And the A got lost in static, but let's not quibble. 600 million people watched on television. It was humanity's greatest technological achievement, the culmination of a decade of effort, and some people think it was filmed on a soundstage. Let's address the conspiracy theory first, because it's persistent and genuinely baffling. The moon landing hoax theory claims that NASA faked the Apollo 11 landing, and possibly all subsequent Apollo missions, filming them in a studio and presenting the footage as real. Reasons given include the Cold War, space race, made the U.S. desperate to win. The technology didn't exist to actually go to the moon. The Van Allen radiation belts would have killed the astronauts. Various anomalies in photographs and videos prove fakery. None of this holds up under scrutiny. Let's go through it. First, the idea that faking it would have been easier than doing it is backwards. In 1969, special effects technology couldn't have convincingly faked the moon landing footage. The camera techniques, lighting, and physics visible in the videos would have been impossible to fake with available technology. Ironically, it would have been harder to fake a convincing moon landing than to actually go to the moon. Second, the Van Allen belts. These are regions of charged particles trapped by Earth's magnetic field. They do contain radiation, but the Apollo spacecraft passed through them relatively quickly, and the astronauts received total radiation doses comparable to a few chest X-rays. Manageable, not lethal. Third, the photographs. Every supposed anomaly has been explained. Shadows that conspiracy theorists claim prove multiple light sources are actually explained by reflected light and the moon's topography. The lack of stars in photographs is because the lunar surface is so bright that cameras had to use settings that didn't capture dim stars. The flag appears to wave because it has a horizontal rod holding it out, and the astronauts' movements disturbed it. In a vacuum, with no air resistance, it would keep moving. Fourth, and most convincingly, there's independent evidence. The Soviet Union, America's rival in the space race, tracked the Apollo missions. They would have loved to expose a hoax. They didn't, because it wasn't a hoax. Amateur radio operators around the world picked up transmissions from the moon. The astronauts left retroreflectors on the lunar surface mirrors that reflect laser light. Scientists still use them to measure the Earth-Moon distance with incredible precision by bouncing lasers off them. If the moon landing were faked, who put the retroreflectors there? Also, consider the practical problems with faking it. You'd need to convince hundreds of thousands of people who worked on Apollo to maintain a lie for over 50 years. NASA employed about 400,000 people during the Apollo program. Contractors, engineers, technicians, administrators, none of them have provided convincing evidence of a hoax, despite the fact that exposing the greatest fraud in history would make them famous and wealthy. The moon rocks alone disprove the hoax theory. Apollo missions brought back 842 pounds of lunar material. These rocks have been studied by scientists worldwide, including researchers from countries without reason to protect American secrets. The rocks have characteristics: age, composition, isotope ratios, crystal structures that are consistent with formation on an airless body with different geological history from Earth. They couldn't have been faked with 1960s technology. So the moon landing happened. Let's talk about how it happened, because the actual story is more interesting than any conspiracy theory. The Apollo program started in 1961, when President Kennedy announced the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. This was partially about exploration and science, but mostly about Cold War competition. The Soviet Union had launched Sputnik in 1957, putting the first satellite in orbit. They'd put the first human, Yuri Gagarin, in space in 1961. The U.S. was losing the space race and needed a dramatic victory. Going to the moon was chosen partly because it was achievable and partly because the Soviets probably couldn't do it first. Developing the technology would take years and require massive resources, which played to American industrial strengths. NASA began the Mercury program to learn basic spaceflight. Meanwhile, they designed the Saturn V rocket, still the most powerful rocket ever to fly successfully. Standing 363 feet tall, it could lift 310,000 pounds to low Earth orbit. 3 stages. Powered by liquid oxygen and kerosene in the first stage, liquid hydrogen in the upper stages. The engineering was extraordinarily complex and risky. The Apollo spacecraft consisted of 3 parts: the command module, where astronauts lived during most of the mission, the service module with engines and supplies, and the lunar module that would actually land on the moon. The lunar module was particularly ingenious, an ungainly-looking craft that would never have to fly through atmosphere, so it could be designed purely for function in vacuum. Apollo 11 launched on July 16, 1969. Neil Armstrong commanded, with Buzz Aldrin as lunar module pilot and Michael Collins as command module pilot. They reached the moon 3 days later, entered orbit, and on July 20th, Armstrong and Aldrin climbed into the lunar module Eagle, while Collins remained in orbit aboard Columbia. Eagle descended toward the moon's surface. The landing was mostly automated, but as they approached, alarms started going off. The computer was overloaded, receiving more data than it could process quickly. Armstrong took manual control, steering over a boulder field toward a smoother area. Fuel was running low. Houston called out altitude and velocity readings. At 40 seconds of fuel remaining, Armstrong reported, "Contact light." A probe extending from Eagle's legs had touched the surface. "Tranquility Base, here. The Eagle has landed." 6.5 hours later, after preparations and a rest period, Armstrong opened the hatch and climbed down the ladder. Aldrin followed 19 minutes later. They spent 2.5 hours on the surface, collecting samples, taking photographs, setting up experiments, including a seismometer and the retroreflector. They unveiled a plaque. "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969, A.D. We came in peace for all mankind." They planted an American flag, which was a bit awkward given the "for all mankind" rhetoric. Politics and idealism don't always align neatly. Then they returned to Eagle, lifted off, rendezvoused with Collins in Columbia, and headed home. They splashed down in the Pacific on July 24, 1969. The entire mission took 8 days, 3 hours, 18 minutes. 5 more Apollo missions successfully landed on the moon. Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Apollo 13 suffered an oxygen tank explosion and had to abort, becoming a dramatic survival story, but not a landing. The final mission, Apollo 17, flew in December 1972. After that, budget cuts and changing priorities ended the program. 12 men walked on the moon. All American, all during a 4-year period from 1969 to 1972. No one has been back since. Not because we can't, but because we haven't prioritized it. Space exploration is expensive, and the political will to fund it has varied over the decades. The moon landing was a triumph of engineering, science, and human courage. The astronauts rode rockets that had explosive power, equivalent to a small nuclear weapon beneath them. The computers guiding them had less processing power than a modern phone. They traveled to an environment where any malfunction could mean death, with no possibility of rescue if something went seriously wrong. And they did it when the technology was new, when every mission was pioneering. It represented the optimistic, ambitious side of the 1960s, the belief that humanity could accomplish extraordinary things through science, cooperation, and determination. The darker sides of the 60s, the Vietnam War, civil rights struggles, assassinations, social upheaval were happening simultaneously. But for a moment, people around the world looked up and watched humans walk on another world. The fact that some people don't believe it happened is depressing, but not surprising. Conspiracy theories thrive on distrust, on the belief that official narratives conceal hidden truths. And sometimes they do. But the moon landing isn't one of those times. It happened. We can prove it happened. And the evidence is overwhelming. The footprints are still there, by the way. With no wind or weather to erase them, they'll last for millions of years, long after everything else humanity has built has crumbled to dust. Assuming, of course, that someone doesn't eventually build a lunar resort and pave over them, which would be the most human thing imaginable. And if you think people arguing about the moon landing is contentious, well, let's talk about an election. The 2000 election. When democracy got messy in Florida, November 7th, 2000. Americans go to the polls to choose between Republican George W. Bush, and Democrat Al Gore. By the end of the night, the race is too close to call, and everything hinges on Florida. The nation will be treated to terms like hanging Chad, butterfly ballot, and manual recount. Let's establish what happened, which is complicated enough without conspiracy theories. Election night started with TV networks calling Florida for Gore, then retracting that, then calling it for Bush, then retracting that too. The initial results showed Bush ahead by about 1,800 votes out of nearly 6 million cast. This tiny margin automatically triggered a machine recount under Florida law. The machine recount narrowed Bush's lead to about 300 votes. 300. In a state with over 6 million voters. That's 0.005%. Close enough that reasonable people could disagree about who actually won. Gore's campaign requested manual recounts in 4 counties: Miami-Dade, Broward, Palm Beach, and Volusia. Florida used several different voting systems across different counties. Some used optical scan systems where you fill in bubbles. The punch card systems were where problems emerged. When you punch a Chad, the small perforated rectangle that's supposed to detach completely, it doesn't always detach cleanly. Sometimes it hangs by one corner, sometimes by 2, sometimes by 3. Sometimes it dimples but doesn't punch through at all. The question became, how do you determine voter intent when the Chad hasn't fully detached? Florida law said ballots should be counted if voter intent could be determined. But what indicates intent? A hanging Chad? A dimpled Chad? How clear does the indication need to be? Different counties used different standards. Some counted hanging Chads, but not dimpled ones. Some counted all marks that seemed intentional. There was no consistency. Then there was the butterfly ballot in Palm Beach County. The ballot designer, trying to make the text larger and easier to read, arranged candidates on both sides of the page with punch holes down the middle. This created confusion about which hole corresponded to which candidate. Thousands of voters apparently intended to vote for Gore but punched the hole for Pat Buchanan, a far-right candidate. Buchanan himself acknowledged he probably got votes that weren't meant for him. Statistical analysis supports this. Buchanan got 3,459 votes in Palm Beach County, far more than in any other Florida county, in an area that wasn't particularly conservative. Many voters realized their mistake and also voted for Gore, creating overvotes that weren't counted. If those voters had correctly punched Gore's hole, he would have won Florida easily. But ballot design, however confusing, was legal. The manual recounts proceeded slowly. Different counties used different standards for evaluating Chads. The process was public, with observers from both campaigns scrutinizing every ballot. Arguments erupted constantly over whether particular ballots should count. Meanwhile, the legal battles multiplied. Bush's campaign filed suit to stop the manual recounts. Gore's campaign filed suit to extend deadlines. Florida's Secretary of State, Katherine Harris, who was also co-chair of Bush's Florida campaign. The Florida Supreme Court, with a Democratic majority, made decisions that favored Gore. On November 26th, Harris certified the results with Bush ahead by 537 votes. Gore contested the certification. The legal fight continued. On December 8th, the Florida Supreme Court ordered a statewide manual recount of all undervotes ballots where machines detected no vote for president. This would have examined about 45,000 ballots. The recount began on December 9th. Then, on December 9th, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a stay, stopping the recount. On December 12th, they issued their final decision in Bush v. Gore. By a 5-4 vote, they ruled that the recount violated the Equal Protection Clause because different counties used different standards. They also ruled there wasn't time to conduct a recount with consistent standards before the December 12th safe harbor deadline. Therefore, the previously certified results would stand, and Bush had won. The decision was extraordinarily controversial. The 5-justice majority were all Republican appointees. Their reasoning seemed inconsistent with their usual judicial philosophies. The opinion explicitly stated it shouldn't be considered precedent for future cases, which is unusual, and suggests the court knew they were making a political decision, not a legal one. Gore conceded the next day. He gave a gracious speech about accepting the Supreme Court's decision and moving forward. Bush became president, so was it stolen? Was there fraud? Was the fix in? There's no evidence of systematic fraud. There were mistakes, confusion, poor ballot design, inconsistent standards, and partisan officials making decisions that favored their side. But that's different from fraud, which implies deliberate manipulation of vote counts. Multiple organizations conducted post-election analysis, examining ballots under various standards. The results depend on which standards you apply. If you count only cleanly punched ballots, Bush wins. If you count ballots with clear indications of intent regardless of how cleanly punched, Gore might have won. If you include overvotes, where voters marked multiple candidates but intent was clear, Gore probably would have won. The National Opinion Research Center, commissioned by news organizations, examined all 170,000 disputed ballots. Their conclusion: under most realistic counting standards, Bush would have won the limited recounts Gore requested, but Gore would have won a full statewide recount of all disputed ballots. So Gore asked for the wrong recount. If he'd requested a full statewide recount immediately, he might have won. Instead, he requested targeted recounts in Democratic counties, which made his case look more partisan and probably contributed to the Supreme Court stopping it. But there's another wrinkle. The counting standards matter enormously. Two reasonable people examining the same dimpled Chad might reach different conclusions about voter intent. Multiply that by tens of thousands of ballots, and you get uncertainty that can't be eliminated. The 2000 election exposed serious flaws in American voting systems. Punch cards were clearly inadequate. Ballot design needed standardization. Counties within the same state shouldn't use completely different voting technologies. Election officials shouldn't simultaneously serve on partisan campaigns. Many of these issues were addressed afterward. Florida reformed its voting systems. The Help America Vote Act of 2002 provided funding for new voting equipment and established standards. But American elections remain decentralized, with states and counties using different systems, which creates opportunities for inconsistency and controversy. The larger lesson is that democracy is messier than we like to admit. We want elections to have clear winners and losers, decisive results that everyone accepts. Usually they do. But in extremely close elections, uncertainty is unavoidable. The margins are smaller than the error rates in counting and recording votes. You can't definitively determine who won when the difference is a few hundred votes out of millions. The 2000 election also showed how institutions handle contested results. Florida's Supreme Court tried to ensure all votes were counted. The U.S. Supreme Court prioritized finality over completeness. Both positions have merit. Democracy requires that all legitimate votes count, but it also requires that disputes be resolved and power transfer peacefully. Bush served 2 terms as president. His presidency included September 11th, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the 2008 financial crisis, and polarized politics. Whether Gore would have handled things differently is speculation. Alternate history is always uncertain. But the election itself wasn't stolen. At least not in the criminal sense. It was close, messy, controversial, and decided by institutions that made questionable decisions under enormous pressure. That's different from fraud. Even if the result feels unjust to people who think Gore should have won, democracy is a system for resolving disputes peacefully. It's not always fair, not always accurate, not always satisfying, but it's better than the alternatives, which generally involve violence. The 2000 election tested American democracy, and the system survived, if barely. The losing side accepted the result, even while believing it was wrong. The winning side took power. The country moved forward. Not everyone was happy about it, but that's democracy too. And sometimes, the things we remember most clearly are the things we got slightly wrong. And that's where our journey ends. 12 events, 12 myths, 12 times the truth turned out stranger and more nuanced than the stories we tell. The Tea Party was economic protectionism. Columbus stayed, lost his entire life. Salem hanged 20, burned 0. The Civil War was explicitly about slavery. The Wild West had gun control. Pearl Harbor wasn't quite a surprise. Roswell was a weather balloon. We definitely went to the moon. And the 2000 election was messy, but not stolen. History doesn't simplify well. The moment you try, you lose the truth. But the truth is always richer, more human, more fascinating than any myth. So next time someone tells you what really happened, which myth surprised you? Comment below, subscribe for more, and check the description for sources. Sleep well knowing history is messier and stranger than anyone told you. Sweet dreams.